Ever imagine stumbling into fame while trying to solve a completely different problem? Picture this. You're a brilliant engineer in 1760s Belgium, desperately trying to impress the aristocracy with your latest musical contraption, when suddenly you become the laughingstock of high society for all the wrong reasons. But here's the twist that nobody saw coming, including our hapless inventor himself. That embarrassing disaster would accidentally birth an entire industry worth billions today and change how humans move forever. We're diving into the bizarre, chaotic, and absolutely hilarious origin story of roller skates. This isn't your typical invention tale of careful planning and methodical testing. No, this is the story of John Joseph Merlin, a man whose greatest creation came from his most spectacular public failure. And trust me, when I say spectacular, I mean the kind of disaster that gets talked about for centuries. Today, we're uncovering how one engineer's terrible decision-making skills accidentally revolutionized transportation, recreation, and gave birth to an entire culture that spans from disco rinks to modern roller derby. These are the events that prove sometimes the best inventions come from the worst possible timing, creating a legacy born from pure, unfiltered chaos. One John Joseph Merlin wasn't trying to invent roller skates at all. He was obsessed with something completely different. The year was 1760, and this Belgian inventor had his sights set on musical instruments, clockwork mechanisms, and impressing London's elite social circles. Merlin was what you'd call a serial inventor, the kind of guy who couldn't see a problem without immediately designing 17 different solutions. His workshop was crammed with half-finished automatons, experimental clocks, and musical devices that would make a modern synthesizer look simple. But Merlin had one fatal flaw that would define his entire career. He was absolutely terrible at thinking through the consequences of his inventions. This wasn't just absent-mindedness. This was a man who would build incredibly complex machines without ever considering what happened when you actually tried to use them in the real world. And nowhere would this character flaw be more spectacularly displayed than at one particular London party. The disaster began with a violin and a pair of metal wheels. Merlin had been invited to a masquerade ball at Carlisle House, one of London's most prestigious social venues. This wasn't just any party. This was the kind of event where you either made your reputation or destroyed it completely. The guest list read like a who's who of British high society, and Merlin saw this as his golden opportunity to showcase his latest invention. His plan seemed brilliant in his workshop. He would make a grand entrance, rolling smoothly across the ballroom floor while playing a beautiful melody on his violin. The metal wheels he'd attached to his shoes would allow him to glide effortlessly, creating an otherworldly effect that would leave the audience mesmerized. He'd practiced the violin piece countless times, perfected the mechanics of his wheeled shoes, and rehearsed his entrance until he could perform it with his eyes closed. There was just one tiny detail Merlin had completely overlooked, a detail so obvious that any reasonable person would have considered it immediately. He had absolutely no idea how to stop. The entrance itself was actually going perfectly until it wasn't. Picture the scene. London's most elegant ballroom filled with powdered wigs, silk gowns, and the kind of people who considered watching paint dry a thrilling evening activity. The room falls silent as the doors swing open, and in glides John Joseph Merlin, violin in hand, rolling majestically across the polished marble floor like some sort of musical angel. For exactly 12 seconds he was a genius. The crowd gasped in amazement as this mysterious figure seemed to defy the very laws of physics. producing hauntingly beautiful music while floating across the floor. Ladies fanned themselves dramatically, gentlemen adjusted their monocles in wonder, and Merlin basked in what he assumed would be eternal glory. Then physics remembered it had a job to do. What happened next became the most talked about party disaster in London history. Merlin, still sawing away at his violin like a man possessed, suddenly realized he was picking up speed. The marble floor was far more slippery than his wooden workshop, and gravity had some very strong opinions about his trajectory. He tried to slow down by dragging his feet, but the metal wheels just sparked against the stone, sending him careening even faster toward the far wall. The crowd's gasps of amazement quickly turned into shrieks of horror as they watched this musical madman rocket across their elegant soiree like a runaway cannonball. Merlin, still clutching his violin because priorities, crashed directly into a massive mirror worth more than most people's houses. The impact was so spectacular that witnesses described it as sounding like a small explosion, followed by what one observer called the most expensive wind chimes in British history. The aftermath was even worse than the crash itself. Merlin lay sprawled in a pile of mirror fragments, his violin in pieces, his metal wheels bent beyond recognition, and his dignity scattered across the ballroom floor like confetti. But the real damage wasn't physical. This wasn't just any mirror he'd destroyed. This was an ornate, handcrafted masterpiece that had been the centerpiece of Carlisle House for decades. The silence that followed was deafening. London's elite stood frozen, not quite sure whether they'd witnessed a revolutionary artistic performance or the world's most expensive case of property damage. Merlin, bleeding from several cuts and thoroughly humiliated, had accidentally created the most memorable entrance in social history. Unfortunately, it was memorable for all the wrong reasons. The story spread through London's gossip networks faster than Merlin had rolled across that ballroom floor, cementing his reputation as the man who turned a sophisticated invention into a weapon of mass destruction. So there you have it, the origin story of roller skates. John Joseph Merlin crashed his way into history, literally shattering his reputation while accidentally creating something that would outlast every single person who witnessed his spectacular failure that night. What started as the most embarrassing party entrance in London history became the foundation for an entire industry. From Merlin's catastrophic metal wheels to modern quad skates, inline blades, and everything in between, we owe it all to Merlin's invention. His disaster at Carlisle House didn't just break a mirror. It broke open a whole new way for humans to move through the world. The beautiful irony is that Merlin's greatest invention came from his most humiliating moment. While he was busy trying to impress people with musical gadgets and clockwork contraptions, he accidentally stumbled onto something that would bring joy to millions. Every kid learning to skate, every roller derby queen, every disco dancer gliding under the lights, they're all part of Merlin's unintentional legacy. Sometimes the best discoveries come from the worst mistakes, proving that failure isn't always the end of the story. It might just be the beginning of something incredible.